These are 6 decisions that broke an empire, bankrupted a nation, and killed millions of people. Choosing just one as Britain's worst mistake turns out to be far harder than you'd expect. Because the candidates are catastrophic, they span centuries, and remarkably, one man's name, Winston Churchill, keeps surfacing again and again. Start with a number: £200 billion. That's the estimated annual cost to the British economy right now, in 2025, of a single referendum that passed by a margin of just 3.8 percentage points. But before we get to Brexit, you need to understand something fundamental about Britain. This is a country that has been making colossal, world-altering mistakes for a very long time, and each one reshaped not just Britain, but the entire global order. So let's go through them, weigh the damage, and by the end you can decide which one deserves the title of Britain's worst mistake. We begin in 1925, with a decision that sounds almost comically boring but carried devastating consequences. Winston Churchill, serving as Chancellor of the Exchequer, announced in the House of Commons that Britain would return to the gold standard. The gold standard had been suspended during the First World War, and the question was whether to go back, and if so, at what rate. Churchill pegged the pound sterling at $4.86. The problem was that the free market rate sat around $4.40. British exports became roughly 10% more expensive overnight. Think about what that means for a country built on manufacturing. Britain imported raw materials and exported finished goods. So a 10% price hike on everything you sell to the world is economic self-harm on a massive scale. Churchill didn't make this decision blindly. He had advisors on both sides: Otto Niemeyer at the Treasury and Montague Norman, the governor of the Bank of England, pushed hard for the return to gold. But Churchill also spoke with John Maynard Keynes, arguably the greatest economist of the 20th century, and Reginald McKenna, chairman of the Midland Bank, and both were firmly against it. Churchill privately admitted that Keynes had the better arguments. He told his officials that returning to gold favored the special interests of finance at the expense of the interests of production. He knew, and he did it anyway, because, as he put it, as a matter of practical politics, he had no alternative. The financial establishment wanted gold, and gold they got. Keynes was so appalled that he wrote an entire book about it, titled The Economic Consequences of Mr. Churchill. The return to gold crushed British industry, contributed to the general strike of 1926, a 9-day standoff between the Trades Union Congress and the government that paralyzed the country, and caused years of unnecessary economic pain. Britain eventually abandoned the gold standard in 1931, 6 wasted years later. But this was just the warm-up, because Churchill, the same Winston Churchill, would preside over something far worse. February 1942. Singapore, the so-called impregnable fortress of the British Empire in the Far East. On December 8, 1941, Japanese forces landed in northern Malaya, and 70 days later, Singapore fell. 80,000 British, Indian, and Australian soldiers surrendered to a Japanese force roughly half their size. Churchill called it the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history. His physician, Lord Moran, later wrote that months after the surrender, he found Churchill sitting in his bathroom, wrapped in a towel, staring at the floor. Churchill stopped drying himself and said simply, "I cannot get over Singapore." There's a myth that persists to this day about the fall of Singapore, one you've probably heard. The story goes that the massive 15-inch coastal guns were pointing the wrong way, fixed toward the sea, while the Japanese attacked from the land through Malaya. It's a compelling story, and it's also not true. The guns could traverse. The real failures ran far deeper. Overconfidence. Racism, frankly, a flat refusal to believe that Japanese forces could fight effectively in jungle terrain. Poor leadership on the ground. Lieutenant General Arthur Percival, who led the surrender, has gone down in history as one of the most hapless commanders Britain ever fielded. His Japanese counterpart, General Tomoyuki Yamashita, advanced nearly 1,000 kilometers in less than 10 weeks, a masterclass in aggressive warfare. Even the naval dimension was a disaster. HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse, two of Britain's most powerful warships, were sunk by Japanese aircraft just days after the Malayan landings, leaving Singapore without naval protection from the outset. The human cost was staggering. 80,000 men became prisoners of war, joining 50,000 already captured in Malaya. And many of those prisoners died from neglect, abuse, or forced labor. The strategic cost matched it. The fall of Singapore shattered the myth of European invincibility across Asia, marking the beginning of the end of the British Empire in the East, and everyone knew it, even if the formalities took years to catch up. But while British prestige collapsed in Southeast Asia, something even more horrific unfolded on the Indian subcontinent. The Bengal Famine of 1943. An estimated 3 million people died. 3 million. And here's what makes it particularly damning. It wasn't caused by drought. Recent studies analyzing soil moisture data from 1870 to 2016 reconstructed agricultural droughts across the subcontinent, examining 6 major famines between 1873 and 1943. The Bengal Famine was the only one not linked directly to soil moisture deficit or crop failure. It was, in the words of the researchers, a complete policy failure. And this brings us back, again, to Winston Churchill. Churchill's views on India were not subtle. He is quoted as saying, "I hate Indians. They are a beastly people with a beastly religion. The famine was their own fault for breeding like rabbits." The full picture is more complicated than a single quote. Defenders of Churchill point out that more than 1 million tons of grain arrived in Bengal between August 1943 and the end of 1944, much of it on Australian ships, even while food rationing was in effect in England. Churchill also replaced the lethargic Viceroy Lord Linlithgow with the more capable Field Marshal Wavell, specifically to improve conditions on the ground. But critics, including Indian politician Shashi Tharoor, argue that Churchill has the blood of millions on his hands, people the British prefer to forget. When forced to choose between stockpiling food for potential future needs in Europe and sending food to save millions of actually dying Indians, Churchill chose the stockpiles, and his racial prejudices made that choice easier for him. The Nobel Prize-winning economist Amartya Sen argued as far back as 1981 that there should have been enough supplies to feed Bengal in 1943. The famine was a failure of distribution, of priorities, of basic human decency. Pinning the blame entirely on Churchill alone is misleading. Leaving him out of the story is impossible. Just 4 years after the Bengal Famine, Britain made another decision regarding India that dwarfed even that catastrophe in lasting consequences. On July the 18th, 1947, Britain's Parliament passed the Indian Independence Act under Prime Minister Clement Attlee. Partition would take effect on August 15th. The entire subcontinent would be divided along religious lines into Hindu-majority India and Muslim-majority Pakistan, the new state that Muhammad Ali Jinnah had campaigned for as head of the Muslim League. The man tasked with overseeing the handover was Lord Mountbatten, Britain's last Viceroy of India, who rushed the timeline dramatically, compressing what was supposed to be years of planning into a matter of months. The man tasked with drawing the actual border was Cyril Radcliffe, a British lawyer who had never set foot in India before. He was given roughly 5 weeks to divide a subcontinent of 400 million people. What followed was the largest forced migration in human history. 15 million Hindus, Sikhs and Muslims rushed to cross hastily drawn borders, and estimates of the dead range from 200,000 to 2 million. Women were specifically targeted as symbols of community honor, with up to 100,000 raped or abducted. The communal violence was apocalyptic. The consequences didn't end in 1947. Partition created two nations locked in perpetual hostility. India and Pakistan have fought multiple wars, and both are now nuclear powers. 200 million Muslims remain a minority in India, and the political tensions that partition created continue to shape the subcontinent to this day. One rushed decision by a departing empire, and the wounds are still bleeding nearly 80 years later. Perhaps the single most psychologically devastating moment for Britain, the moment the country was forced to confront what it had become, arrived in 1956. The Suez Crisis. On July the 26th, 1956, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal Company, which had been controlled by British and French interests. British Prime Minister Anthony Eden was furious, and by many accounts became obsessed with removing Nasser from power. Britain, France, and Israel hatched a plan. Israel would invade Egypt on October 29th. Britain and France would issue an ultimatum, then join the fighting on October 31st, nominally as peacekeepers, but really to seize back the canal. Militarily, it worked. The operation succeeded. But here's the thing about empires. They don't always fall when they lose wars. They fall when they lose the ability to decide. The United States was appalled. President Eisenhower hadn't been told about the operation in advance, and he was livid. He pressured the International Monetary Fund to deny Britain financial assistance, and tens of millions of pounds drained from Britain's reserves in the first week of November 1956. Britain faced the very real prospect of devaluing the pound sterling. So Britain backed down. The United Nations deployed peacekeepers. Petrol rationing arrived in December 1956 and lasted until May 1957. Anthony Eden resigned on January the 9th, 1957, officially citing health reasons, though everyone understood the real cause. Harold Macmillan, who had initially supported the invasion, became Prime Minister. Eden had been the last Prime Minister to act as if Britain was still a world power, and the first to face the reality that she was not. Suez didn't end the British Empire on paper, but it ended it in the minds of everyone who mattered. The historian Michael Howard once affirmed that Suez was Britain's post-war nadir, and in chaotic times, he said, it was oddly comforting to have that certainty to cling to. But we might need a new nadir. On June 23, 2016, 33.5 million people voted in the Brexit referendum. David Cameron, the Prime Minister who called the vote expecting to win it comfortably, watched his gamble fail. Boris Johnson, the most prominent face of the Leave campaign, had led the charge to exit the European Union. Nigel Farage and his movement had spent years building the political pressure that made the referendum unavoidable. 17.4 million voted to leave. 16.1 million voted to remain. Leave won by 3.8 points, 51.9% to 48.1%. It was the first time in modern history that a major developed economy voluntarily raised trade barriers and pulled back from international economic integration. Economists at the time forecast a long-term hit of about 4% of GDP. They were right about the direction and wrong about the magnitude. By the end of 2025, Brexit had reduced UK GDP by 6 to 8%. Investment dropped by 12 to 18%. Employment fell by 3 to 4%. Productivity declined by 3 to 4%. Bloomberg Economics estimated the annual cost at 100 to over 200 billion pounds. Trade with the European single market, Britain's largest trading partner, accounting for roughly half of all UK exports, dropped sharply as friction replaced frictionless access. These losses didn't arrive overnight. The impact was barely visible in 2017 and 2018, accumulating slowly, steadily, like water damage in a house. Uncertainty persisted for nearly 5 years. Trade barriers rose. Firms diverted management time and resources away from productive activity toward compliance and restructuring. The damage was a slow burn. In 2016, Mark Carney noted that the British economy was 90% the size of Germany's. By the time of the Truss Kwarteng mini-budget in September 2022, it had fallen below 70%. The public knows it. As of January 2025, 55% of British people said Brexit was the wrong decision, with only 30% still supporting it. Regret has grown steadily since July 2022. There's a cruel demographic irony embedded in all of this. Nearly 3/4 of 18 to 24-year-olds voted to remain, while only 40% of those aged 65 and over did the same. The people who will live longest with the consequences were the ones who most opposed the decision. As the UK approaches the 10th anniversary of the referendum in June 2026, the picture is bleak. 7 prime ministers in a decade, a demographic slide, a 6 to 8% GDP hole that shows no sign of closing. The economists' initial forecasts were, if anything, too optimistic. So, Britain's worst mistake. Is it the gold standard, a decision even its architect knew was wrong? Is it Singapore, where 80,000 men surrendered because their leaders couldn't imagine losing to a non-European army? Is it the Bengal Famine, where 3 million people starved while grain was stockpiled for a future that hadn't arrived? Is it the Partition of India, a 5-week cartographic exercise that killed up to 2 million people and poisoned a subcontinent for generations? Is it Suez, the moment Britain discovered it was no longer permitted to act like an empire? Or is it Brexit, the slow-motion economic catastrophe that a slim majority voted for, and a growing majority now regrets? Each of these decisions shares something in common: overconfidence, a refusal to listen to the people who knew better. the prioritization of political convenience over observable reality. Churchill knew Keynes was right about the gold standard. Eden knew Eisenhower would oppose Suez. The economists knew what Brexit would cost. But there's one crucial difference. Every other mistake on this list was made in the context of war, or empire, or the enormous pressures of decolonization. Brexit was made in peacetime, voluntarily, by a country that already possessed what most nations spend decades trying to achieve: frictionless access to the largest single market on Earth. And then it voted to give it up. That's not the fall of an empire. It's not the fog of war or the chaos of partition. It's a country standing in its own kitchen, looking at a perfectly good house, and deciding to set fire to the roof. Not because it had to, but because 51.9% thought it might look better that way. Britain has made terrible mistakes across 5 centuries. The ones made under duress at least carry the dignity of necessity. Brexit has no such excuse. It was a choice, freely made, loudly warned against, and quietly regretted by more people with every passing year. That might just make it the worst one of all.